because I want to point out to you where I'm doing research. And if you remember, in integral theory, there's many different lines of development. And there are different things that are associated with those lines of development. And the particular one that I focused on was the ego self-identity line, fundamentally about who am I? So when we talk about what is the ego, it's what each of us considers to be I. So it's not me or mine, it's not mine, it's not the things that I own, but it's when I stop and check inside, how far does my identity actually go? How wide is that circle of care and compassion? How wide is that passion for justice and equality? And so this is really about the development of that. From a little bit more technical perspective, those of you that meditate, you'll recognize that the process of meditation essentially drops you back into the witness self, which is the far lens here. And then there's a part of ourselves, like the distal self, which is the me. Which is the object of I, meaning it's mine. So I own a black bike, or that I work at this particular company. But then there's the proximate self, which is really that which I can't objectify, and that's ego. So that's the area that I'm playing in, and the whole process of consciousness development is basically trying to get your ego further and further back by essentially dropping back into the witness, and that kind of helps to hold the ego in its development. So fundamentally, ego development means an increasing capacity to take perspective. So it's going from the unique individual way that we see, being able to see through multiple lenses. It's essentially the shift where all of a sudden you're able to literally hold someone else's perspective and embody it, cognitively get it, and essentially work from that space if needed. And so as we develop with our self-identity, as we develop into later action logics, we become capable of taking more and more and more perspectives. And so some of the leaders, all leaders that I work with, are very comfortable moving into these different perspectives, whether it's kind of hardcore business metrics that need to be done, or more of the hard work which needs to be inquired to along the way. It's essentially a capacity to flow effectively across multiple perspectives, and ultimately consciousness development really is about being able to flow into any perspective, because consciousness is all perspectives. So the way that Robert Keegan frames this is that what gradually happens is not just a linear accretion of more and more that one can look at or think about, but there's really a qualitative shift in the very shape of the window or the lens through which one sees the world. And this is what happens in the process of ego development, in that we're literally shifting and shaping the way that we understand reality. And so I was curious about people who had essentially done this depth work, gotten to where they are, and how do they then engage with sustainability work. And so this is another way of looking at those different lines of development, but in this case they're vertical on the map. And you can see a variety of them. This is Ken Wilber's levels or stages of consciousness on the left with his particular altitude markers. There are colors and a variety of different lines. And the particular one that we're working with here is the self-identity one, the second one from the left there. And I focused specifically on people who were assessed at the highest stages or the latest stages of that line. And so specifically folks who hold what's called strategist or an ironist action logic. But you can see that kind of correlates to teal and turquoise and ultraviolet, Ken's altitude markers of consciousness. So let's not pretend that it's all lines and levels like that, because it's not that simple, of course. Consciousness is probably maybe better articulated with something like this, with a fractal, but again, these are all just ways of pointing at a mystery. So let's talk about some insights from my research. What I'm going to do here is, so my core research question was, how do leaders with a late-stage action method design sustainability initiatives? And in the process of inquiring into how they design, I learned a lot about how they actually engage in sustainability initiatives as well, because design tends to be a role to these folks. And you'll find that these results are actually completely applicable to any type of leadership. It's not sustainability specific, but the particular inquiry that I dove into was really around sustainability leaders. And so I had three themes that emerged. One was around the whole domain of being. And so for me, the theme was that they designed from this profound foundation. And the data that came up was that they hold sustainability work as a spiritual practice. The design itself is grounded in a transpersonal meaning for them. And then they're really masters at embracing and holding on to uncertainty, and in themselves and others, and really having deep trust in the process and in themselves and in others. What I'm going to do today is not go in depth into all of these areas, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of all the findings, and then I'm going to hone in on 8 specific competencies and 3 practices, and give you some depth, some insight into that. And then I have a handout which has actually all of the 15 competencies that I've found, and the dissertation is just about ready, and I'll be putting together an executive summary of those findings and get that up to the community. So there was another dimension here of reflecting. So we had being, and then we had how they actually reflect. And what was clear was that these folks have access to powerful internal resources and theories to design. And so we found that the use of intuition and other non-rational ways of knowing was very, very high. This was a key data point that people used on a regular basis and accessed. And they also used pretty sophisticated frameworks to also better understand reality, specifically systems theory and complexity theory and interval theory. And finally, there was a third general area of engaging, how they actually, after they've grounded themselves in their being and reflected, how they actually engage. And this was truly a process of adaptive leadership and adaptive management. And what that looked like is that they were in regular dialogue with the system to consistently adapt the design. And I'll go more deep into that to give you some more specific examples. They adopted a variety of roles that were really critical for ensuring development of the initiative itself. And then there was a strong focus on regular cultivation of development in themselves and in others and in the collective that they were working with as part of the process of engaging the sustainability initiative. Meaning that they really actively recognized the limits that they bumped up against while they were trying to do the sustainability initiative, and they fully drove their own development or invited their own development into another level, as well as that of the colleagues that they worked with, as well as the collective, the entire collective that they were engaged with. So let's go a little bit deeper. I'm going to start off with 8 competencies that if you were to focus on, I really feel help support the development of conscious leadership for sustainability or any type of leadership. And so first of all, it has to do with really using some sophisticated theories and frameworks. And what I came to understand during this inquiry was that as consciousness develops, it needs a language to be able to ground here. It has to be able to come through and articulate itself in a way that others can understand, that communication can happen about what I'm seeing and what I'm understanding. So the first time that you have some sort of amazing insight about the nature of reality, if you don't have words to articulate it, then it's very, very difficult to actually share that with someone and have it validated. Have they had a similar sort of experience? Do they grasp it, right? So words really are a liberating structure for consciousness to come forward. And so what I found was that there's 3 common theories out there that we are engaged with, which these leaders are using, that help articulate, that essentially provide a platform for consciousness to land in as it develops. Meaning, if you are able to, if you're familiar with the basics of systems theory, then all of a sudden you have a common language to talk with others about feedback loops, and about learning, and about flow, and about how if you poke here, something happens over there, and how if, and about acupuncture points and strategic interventions, right? It's like all of a sudden there's a language that consciousness is able to actually work with. The same with complexity theory. It's not that people have to be experts in complexity theory, but understanding that concepts like the emergence of novelty, that you can essentially never really have control over a whole system or never fully know it. And so you need to experiment lots and see what happens from those experiments. Those kind of basically understanding the concepts of complexity theory and systems theory and then integral theory, again, provide that opportunity for consciousness to express itself and to be engaged. And so for me, learning these things is actually a catalyst to accelerating the people's development.
Barrett,
Yes.
Question?
Yeah.
She gave some examples from systems in complexity theory about what kinds of concepts and language help share this subtle understanding of different perspectives. So what about integral theory? What are some of the specific types, like before you said, feedback loops and emergence?
Sure. So with integral theory, it's the whole concept of quadrants that are tetra-arising, that there's a cultural dynamic, there's a systems dynamics, there's a psychological dynamic, there's a physical or body dynamic or behavioral dynamic, that all of those are influencing at the same time. That itself is, just knowing that is kind of a liberating structure because you're trying to organize and figure it out. The whole idea of healthy development and whole lives and transcending and including, knowing those things literally provides consciousness with kind of a structure to which it can then kind of figure out and explain things. So another deep sort of bundle of competencies that emerged out here had to do with essentially deeply connecting. And one is this whole notion of grounding sustainability work in deep meaning. So what I found with these leaders and these change agents is that the reason they were doing what they were doing was profoundly connected to their own spiritual practice. For many, it was an expression of how they engaged in the world as a spiritual being. So for some people, it came from a Christian depth space. For some people, it came out of Buddhism. For some people, it came out of Hinduism. But fundamentally, there was a very profound purpose for which they were doing the work that they were doing. And without that purpose, without that regular connection to it, it was difficult for them to continue on with the work. They also used intuitive decision-making and harvesting. So this was a way, it was clear for me that this was essentially kind of like the ace in their sleeve that they had when it came to being faced with tremendous complexity of how do I design a strategy for a global company around sustainability, or how do I trigger an NGO sector in Nigeria to actually take a huge leap in its development. These are such complex systems that folks were engaged in that without access to intuition and without access to non-rational ways of knowing, because they couldn't get their minds around it, without that access, it was very difficult for them. And so one of the people that I worked with told me of this experience of where, actually after having come to the interval sustainability workshop that we had in 2008, he sat down and had a 12-hour download, just full on, just completely writing, and almost as if he was just being a vehicle for this communication coming through. And he spent the last 4 years unpacking that, literally, based on that initial series of writings. And that has become the foundation for all of his work. And so for lots of the other folks, accessing they develop particular meditative practices, or they use common meditative practices to catalyze and have more access to intuition, so that in the moment for really tough decisions, they're able to draw upon it.
So that's what you mean with harvesting?
Yeah.
So just things that keep arising,
But
picking it up and using it.
Yep. And so it's not only taking advantage of the shower epiphanies and the sort of the late night insights that you have, but it's consciously cultivating it. Not all of the participants do this, but some of them really have very clear practices that at a certain point of the design process, they sit down, and it was always at the very beginning or at big decision points. They would sit down, ground themselves profoundly in the purpose of what they're doing, and listen very deeply, clear mind, get completely out of the way, and essentially bring forth the knowledge they had access to in that space. And that became how they would often guide themselves through the book. Now, it wasn't just intuitive decision making that they made. They would also complement it with solid analysis, so they would then use their discriminative mind as well in service of more fully, essentially, executing the initiative. Right? So it was this combination of get the big insights through the intuition, and then use your discriminative mind to essentially roll it out in the gross plane. There's another bundle here that I've called Adaptively Manage and Cultivate Transformation. So first of all, scan and engage the internal environment. It was clear that this competency was vital. And what this means is essentially the ability to be aware of your shadow issues that are arising, be aware of the psychological dynamics that are unfolding in the moment within you, and ultimately in others as well, and engage with it. So that is either work with it so doesn't have as much of a charge, it's not as much of a distraction, it's not as much filtering the way that you see the world, or observe it and rest with it, play with it. There's lots of different ways of engaging with these internal dynamics, but these folks tended to be very astute about what was happening internally and fluent in how to actually work with those dynamics that came up so that they didn't get in the way of doing the work. Because if I show up in a meeting and I am either really frustrated from an interaction I had in a previous meeting, or I am judging the presenter, or I am attracted to somebody in the meeting, right? Anything like that. Those all will get in the way of me being able to be fully present and bring the best that I can to actually helping the meeting move forward and And so folks had a real capacity to flow through those psychological dynamics, and they use different tools like the 3-2-1 process, which you may be aware of. There's all sorts of tools to work with shadow learning. Dialogue with the system. So this comes out of the complexity theory work, and essentially this is a process of recognizing that the system that you're engaging with, whether it's a community that you're working with to develop, or an organization that's trying to take its next step forward in its sustainability strategy, or an NGO community, as in the case of some folks who are working in Nigeria that were in the study. What they did is they didn't pretend that they actually knew the whole system, that they actually knew what to do with respect to that. But what they did do was they knew that they could get into dialogue with it, meaning that they could essentially observe what was happening to the best that they could, try and get a lot of different perspectives on the system by doing interviews with different stakeholders within the system, and then actually experiment and try things. So come up with a design, come up with a variety of pilots, just like Experimentation is doing, and put them out there. And then listen to how the system responds. Listen to what it does. So what did the community like, and what did it reject? And what seemed to actually drive positive movement forward, and what actually had blowback and ended up being more of a problem. Your intervention actually caused problems, right? So there was kind of a clear commitment to ongoing dialogue with the system as a way of working with these complex domains. Create developmental conditions. This is another concept that comes out of the complexity theory as well, and is something that these folks did, which is essentially if you can imagine that if you want to get from point A to point B, so if an organization wants to have a fully embedded sustainability strategy that's part of the way that they do business, it's not just an add-on CSR program, but if they want to go from not having that to a fully embedded strategy, because organizations are so tiny, you can't get your hands around them, you can't really force them to go from point A to point B. In complexity theory, they're called complex adaptive systems, meaning that they're always changing, and they're always learning from each other, all the different elements. And so you can't make them go anywhere, right? But what you can do, and what these sustainability change agents were doing, was creating initial conditions that supported their development. So if you have a child and you give it lots of love and lots of attention and listen to it closely and give it the right nutrition, that's a way of creating the initial conditions for the child to develop in a healthy way. And they were doing the same thing with the systems that they were working with the organizations that they were working with the projects that they would specifically go out and create the initial conditions. So in some cases, that looked like they would bring together the thought leaders in the organization, or bring together the people that have authority, power, and influence on a regular basis, similar to what Experience Integral is doing here on a regular basis, bringing people together for that exchange. That's one way of creating initial conditions for the system to develop. They would also do things like have courses. You know, if there was a need for a technical understanding of the way the carbon market works, because we need to figure out that in order to come up with a revenue stream for our company, then they would bring in a course that would essentially provide that initial knowledge for people to engage with. So that was another example of creating initial conditions and creating developmental conditions. So there were also 3 practices, and that people engaged in on a regular basis. And these will be very familiar to you, but I think it's worth stating that these were things that everybody was doing. One was meditation. So there was a regular practice that all folks had, that they had had for years, of meditation. And it varied, and there were different reasons that they did meditation, different ways that they did meditation, but that was a core practice. Reflective journaling was also a way of taking what is subject to them and making it an object. So actually writing about the inner experiences that they're having, the challenges that they're having, and that process itself it catalyzes development, is the theory here. So it's something that they have been doing and continue to do as part of development as they're trying to do these large-scale sustainability initiatives. And the third one was that they were working with a coach or a mentor. So they were working with people that held a later stage action logic than they did if they were trying to develop in that area, or they were working with people that were just better technically at what they were trying to figure out. So, or in some cases they were working with people that were able to better access different state experiences. So it's important, and what I picked up from these leaders as well, is that they were really willing to take different mentors for different reasons. It didn't have to be one sort of superwoman that they could call up that would figure out everything from the, what do we do about the business model for the certification initiative in bananas, plus, how do I access God, plus, how do I, understand sort of the nature of reality, right? It wasn't one person that they went to for all of those things. What they did was they really drew upon the appropriate coach and the appropriate mentor according to what they needed, and they didn't pretend that one person could do all those things for them. So that's a brief overview, and I'm happy to share more about this as we go forward offline. And this has been a profound journey for me because of what I've learned about my own change agency and my own self, and then really feeling like there has been an articulation in this work of the next stages for change agents to step into if they want to take their own capacity to a higher level. I was able to articulate 15 different competencies. I was able to articulate the key roles that people take at different stages of development with respect to being a change agent, and a whole variety of other insights. And so for me, it's really been kind of the end of a long journey that I feel is just the beginning of now working this into leadership development programs for sustainability leaders. And so on that note, there is a course that I'm doing starting in April with a NOOC that will focus largely on developing people's action logic in service of becoming a more conscious leader or change agent for sustainability. There's information about it on the table over there. And so at this point, I'd like to open up for any questions if we have about 5 minutes.
I have a question. You were writing, the last sheet was about the practices. Did they all do this reflective journaling? They all did it?
No, I think that my numbers were something maybe 75%.
Yeah. Interesting.
In the meditation, you didn't select them beforehand if they were doing any of these practices, you just found this out?
Yeah.
And then also about 75%?
No, all of them.
All of them.
All of them have meditation.
Interesting. And probably all of them work with coaches and mentors, isn't it?
At some point or another, yeah.
I'm also curious about the projects or the companies that these people are involved in. Because is there a palpable effect of them being such amazing, well-rounded, well-developed leaders? What happens to what they do?
Yeah, exactly. So the projects themselves were fascinating, but the reason why I went down this track is because there's actually pretty significant literature that indicates that developmental maturity or later stage action logics, or a more complex way of making meaning, is correlated with more effective leadership. So in the ways that leadership is measured in modern organizational systems, which typically is like 360 or something like that, folks who hold later action logics tend to score higher on those. And so I was interested in, well, if that's the case, then let's say that more conscious or leaders with later stage action logics are more likely to be more effective in sustainability work. So what can we do to cultivate their development?
I have actually two questions. The first one is, could you tell us something about the leaders you have selected, their background? Were they formal leaders or were not? Just to have an idea of the type of people you have interviewed. And the second one is how I wonder, I don't know if you have an answer, it's a big question actually. I wonder how they deal with resistances. Because I can imagine that you do have, a good plan and a good idea about how to implement the sustainability initiative, but that the environment next to those persons maybe was not that friendly in the sense that it did not encourage that. So how, if you have any idea of experiences, how they dealt with that?
I do. There's a specific competency on that that I identified. So let me get back to your first part, which was a little bit more information about the people that I worked with. So essentially, they were people who had formal leadership positions, or they were mid-level within an organization. So in one case, it would be the sustainability director for a global 100 company. In other cases, it would be the executive director of an NGO. In another case, it was someone who had been at a director level within the United Nations system for many, many, many years, and had done projects in 40 countries. And in some cases, it would be someone who was a change agent within a consultancy, who was essentially kind of a strong consultant within a larger program, but doing change agency work. That person in particular was working on helping First Nations in Canada to build full-on community development programs. So First Nations is the way they talk about indigenous groups in Canada. And so he was working with entire kind of indigenous groups, entire First Nations, and helping them to do community development. And then other people, a fair number of these people were independent consultants who were then working within systems. It's difficult for folks who have a late-stage action logic to stay within kind of mainstream business structures, even mainstream NGO structures. They tend to need to work a little bit more outside of the system and intervening. So with respect to what did they do about resistances, the competency that I came up around this is go with the energy. And that was a consistent theme that came up. And so what go with the energy means is that when there's resistance, you're like water and you flow around it. And so if a group comes together that have the authority and the power and the influence around a sustainability initiative, and they're willing to fund this but not this, these folks aren't forcing the group to go in that direction. It's going, okay, let's go with what they're willing to do, what they're willing to fund, with the understanding that you can start anywhere and go everywhere. Meaning that once the flow starts, then the next steps beyond that can get you back to maybe where you were going. But if you stop the flow entirely, then the sustainability initiative has a strong chance of not going up. So that was one thing that was they really went with where was the energy. However, that was where there was flow. They also went with where there were blockages, meaning if there were stakeholders in the system that were sticks in the mud, that were really stubborn, then they were not afraid to also confront those people and invite them into a new perspective, or invite them into noticing potentially some shadowish stuff that was going on with them. And they also, as I mentioned earlier, went with any blockages that arose inside themselves and inquired into them, holding them, actively working with them, but noticing them. So it was this, going with the energy is not just going where it's easy and flowing, yes, they did flow work, but they also were willing to consciously engage the obstacles that came up. Questions or insights?
Well, I was wondering, Barrett, you're also a change agent and sustainability leader yourself. Throughout this research, what has been the one thing that has most changed your practice as a change agent?
Yeah, experimenting. Really having a deep commitment to prototyping, trying things, testing them, recognizing that we really don't understand as much as we pretend that we understand, as much as we think we understand. And just coming to that with a total humility into the mystery of what I'm engaging in with the people. I was concurrently working with Jenny, actually, helping to design what will be about a 20 million euro program to help advance sustainability in the cocoa sector, working across 5 countries. So while I'm doing this research, figuring out how these folks are doing it, we're also trying to do it along the way. And so I have lots of sort of kind of real-time reflections about that. And we embedded in the design actually a fair amount of experimentation and opportunity to experiment with the funding as we go forward in service of being in dialogue with the system. So what that practically looks like is that we're going to ask the system to compete with proposals for addressing key issues in cocoa sustainability like quality, productivity, and professionalization of farmers. And then essentially see what sort of feedback we get from the system, and then go test it, and then release another round of funding later on based upon what we learned from this first round. So that would be part. So why don't we stop there so we can continue on with the program. I'm excited to continue to share this with those of you that would like to learn more, because this really has been the first research that's been done on leaders in the field that hold these latest action logics. There's never before been done research like this, and it's profoundly applicable to not only sustainability leadership, but also other types of leadership as well. And so you have a last question. Why don't we connect afterwards just with respect to the Thank you.
Thank you.